Section 22 of Little Masterpieces of American Wit and Humor, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kimberly Sossin. Little Masterpieces of American Wit and Humor, Volume 2. Edited by Thomas Lansing Masson. Section 22. The House That Jack Built. Behold the mansion reared by Deedle Jack. See the malt stored in many a plethoric sack in the proud cirque of Ivan's bivouac. Mark how the rat's felonious fangs invade the golden stores in John's pavilion laid. Anon with velvet foot and Tarquin strides, subtle Grimalkin to his quarry glides, Grimalkin grim that slew the fierce rodent, whose tooth insidious Johann's sackcloth rent. Lo, now the deep-mouthed canine foes assault, that vex the avenger of the stolen malt, stored in the hallowed precincts of that hall, that rose complete at Jack's creative call. Here stalks the impetuous cow with crumpled horn, whereon the exacerbating hound was torn, who bade the feline slaughter beast that slew the rat predacious, whose keen fangs ran through the textile fibers that involve the grain which lay in Hans's inviolate domain. Here walks forlorn the damsel crowned with rue, lactiferous spoils from vaccine drugs who drew of that corniculate beast whose tortuous horn tossed to the clouds in fierce vindictive scorn the harrowing hound whose braggart bark and stir arched the lithe spine and reared the indignant fur of puss that with verminicidal claw struck the weird rat in whose insatiate maw lay reeking malt that erst in Juan's courts we saw. Robed in senescent garb that seems in sooth too long a prey to Kronos' iron tooth, behold the man whose amorous lips incline full with Eros' osculative sign to the lorn maiden whose lactalbic hands drew albulactic bovine wealth from lacteal glands of that immortal bovine, by whose horn distort to realm ethereal was born the beast Catulian, vexed of the sly Ulysses quadrupedal, who made die the old mordacious rat that dared devour antecedonous ale in John's domestic bower. Lo, here with hirsute honours doffed, succinct, of saponaceous locks the priest who linked in Hymen's golden bands the torn unthrift, whose means exiguous stared through many a rift, even as he kissed the virgin all forlorn, who milked the cow with implicated horn, who in fine wrath the canine torturers skied, that dared to vex the insidious muricide, who let auroral effluence through the pelt of the sly rat that robbed the palace Jack had built. The loud cantankerous Shanghai comes at last, whose shouts aroused the shorn ecclesiast, who sealed the vows of Hymen's sacrament to him who, robed in garments indigent, exosculates the damsel lachrymose, the emulgator of that horned brute morose, that tossed the dog, that worried the cat, that kilt the rat, that ate the malt that lay in the house that Jack built. The late Mr. William R. Travers liked Bermuda enormously, but it would seem that he found its comforts not altogether unalloyed. A friend who once visited him there was congratulating him on his improved appearance. "This is a grand place for change and rest," said his friend. "Just what you needed." "Yes," replied Mr. Travers sadly. This is a magnificent place for both. The niggers look out for the change, and the hotel keepers take the rest." End of section 22.
Section 23 of Little Masterpieces of American Wit and Humor, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by James Curran. Little Masterpieces of American Wit and Humor, Volume 2. Edited by Thomas Lansing Masson. Section 23. St. Peter at the Gate, by an unknown author. St. Peter stood guard at the Golden Gate, with a solemn mien and an air sedate. When up to the top of the golden stair, a man and a woman ascended there. Applied for admission, they came and stood before St. Peter, so great and good, in hopes the city of peace to win, and asked St. Peter to let them in. The woman was tall and lank and thin, with a scraggly beardlet upon her chin. The man was short and thick and stout. His stomach was built so to round it out. His face was pleasant, and all the while he wore a kindly and genial smile. The choirs in the distance the echoes woke, and the man kept still while the woman spoke. "O thou who guardest the gate," said she, "we too come hither beseeching thee, to let us enter the heavenly land, and play our harps with the angel band. Of me, St. Peter, there is no doubt. There is nothing from heaven to bar me out. I've been to meetings 3 times a week. I almost always rise and speak. I've told the sinners about the day when they'd repent their evil way. I've told my neighbors, I've told them all, about Adam and Eve and the primal fall. I've shown them what they'd have to do if they'd pass in with the chosen few. I've marked their path of duty clear, laid out the plan for their whole career. I've talked and talked to them loud and long, for my lungs are good and my voice is strong. So good St. Peter, you'll clearly see, the gates of heaven are open to me. But my old man, I regret to say, hasn't walked exactly the narrow way. He smokes and he swears, and grave faults he's got, and I don't know whether he'll pass or not. He never would pray with earnest vim, or go to revival, or join in a hymn. So I had to leave him in sorrow there, while I, with the chosen, united in prayer. He ate what the pantry chanced to afford, while I, in my purity, sang to the Lord. And if cucumbers were all he got, it's a chance if he merited them or not. But oh, St. Peter, I love him so. To the pleasures of heaven, please let him go. I've done enough, a saint I've been. Won't that atone? Can't you let him in? By my grim gospel, I know 'tis so, that the unrepentant must fry below. But isn't there some way that you can see, that he may enter who's dear to me? It's narrow a gospel by which I pray, but the chosen expect to find some way of coaxing or fooling or bribing you, so that the relation can amble through. And say, St. Peter, it seems to me, this gate isn't kept as it ought to be. You ought to stand by that opening there, and never sit down in that easy chair. And say, St. Peter, my sight is dimmed, but I don't like the way your whiskers are trimmed. They cut too wide and outward toss. They'd look better narrow, cut straight across. Well, we must be going our crowns to win, so open, St. Peter, and we'll pass in. St. Peter sat quiet and stroked his staff, but spite of his office he had to laugh. Then said with a fiery gleam in his eye, "Who's tending this gateway? You or I?" And then he arose, in his stature tall, and pressed a button upon the wall, and said to the imp who answered the bell, "Escort this lady around to hell." The man stood still as a piece of stone, stood sadly, gloomily, there alone. A lifelong settled idea he had, that his wife was good and he was bad. He thought the woman went down below, then he would certainly have to go. That if she went to the regions dim, there wasn't a ghost of a show for him. Slowly he turned, his habit bent, to follow wherever the woman went. St. Peter, standing on duty there, observed that the top of his head was bare. He called the gentleman back and said, "Friend, how long have you been wed?" 30 years, with a weary sigh. And then he thoughtfully added, "Why?" St. Peter was silent. With his head bent down, he raised his hands and scratched his crown. Then, seeming a different thought to take, slowly, half to himself, he spake. 30 years with that woman there, no wonder the man hasn't any hair. Swearing is wicked, smoke's no good. You smoke and swore, I should think you would. 30 years with a tongue so sharp, oh, Angel Gabriel, give him a harp. A jeweled harp with a golden string. Good sir, pass in there where the angels sing. Gabriel, give him a seat alone, one with a cushion, up near the throne. Call up some angels to play their best. Let him enjoy the music and rest. See that on the finest ambrosia he feeds. He's had about all the hell he needs. It isn't just hardly the thing to do, to roast him on heaven and in the future too. They gave him a harp with golden strings, a glittering robe with a pair of wings. And he said, as he entered the realm of day, "Well, this beats cucumber, anyway." And so the scriptures have come to pass. The last shall be first, and the first shall be last. End of St. Peter at the Gate.
Section 24 of Little Masterpieces of American Wit and Humor, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Scott Bennett. Little Masterpieces of American Wit and Humor, Volume 2, edited by Thomas Lansing Masson. Section 24. The Thompson Street Poker Club, by Henry Guy Carleton. Some curious points in the noble game unfolded. When Mr. Tudor Williams entered the gilded halls of the Thompson Street Poker Club Saturday evening, it was evident that fortune had smeared him with prosperity. He wore a straw hat with a blue ribbon, an expression of serene content, and a glass amethyst on his third finger, whose effulgence irradiated the whole room and made the envious eyes of Mr. Cyanide Whiffles stand out like a crab's. Besides these extraordinary furbishments, Mr. Williams had his mustache waxed to fine points, and his back hair was precious with the luster and richness which accompany the use of the attar of Third Avenue roses, combined with the bear's grease dispensed by basement barbers on that fashionable thoroughfare. In sharp contrast to this scintillating entrance was the coming of the Reverend Mr. Thankful Smith, who had been dishevelled by the heat, discolored by a dusty evangelical trip to Coney Island, and oppressed by an attack of malaria which made his eyes bloodshot and enriched his respiration with occasional hiccups, and that steady aroma which is said to dwell in Weehawken breweries. The game began at 8 o'clock, and by 9, and a series of two-pair hands and bull luck, Mr. Gus Johnson was $7 and a nickel ahead of the game, and the Reverend Mr. Thankful Smith, who was banking, was 9 stacks of chips and a dollar bill on the wrong side of the ledger. Mr. Cyanide Whiffles was cheerful as a cricket over 4 winnings amounting to 69 cents. Professor Brick was calm, and Mr. Tudor Williams was gorgeous and hopeful and laying low for the first jackpot, which now came. It was Mr. Whiffles's deal, and feeling that the eyes of the world were upon him, he passed around the cards with a precision and rapidity which were more to his credit than the IOU from Mr. Williams, which was left over from the previous meeting. Professor Brick had 9 high and declared his inability to make an opening. Mr. Williams noticed a dangerous light come into the Reverend Mr. Smith's eye and hesitated a moment, but having 2 black jacks and a pair of trays, opened with the limit. "I lifts you just $3 toot," said the Reverend Mr. Smith, getting out the wallet and shaking out a wad. Mr. Gus Johnson, who had a 4 flush and very little prudence, came in. Mr. Whiffles sighed and fled. Mr. Williams polished the amethyst, thoroughly examining a scratch on one of its facets, adjusted his collar, skinned his cards, stealthily glanced again at the expression of the Reverend Mr. Smith's eye, and said he would just call. Mr. Whiffles supplied the wants of the gentleman from the pack with the mechanical air of a man who had lost all hope in a hereafter. Mr. Williams wanted 1 card. The Reverend Mr. Smith said he'd take about 3, and Mr. Gus Johnson expressed a desire for a club if it was not too much trouble. Mr. Williams caught another tray, and being secretly pleased, led out by betting a chip. The Reverend Mr. Smith uproariously slammed down a stack of blue chips and raised him $7. Mr. Gus Johnson had captured the 9 of hearts, and so retired. Mr. Williams had 4 chips and $1 left. "I sees dat 7, he said impressively, "and I humps it 10 mo." "Whar's de collateral?" queried the Reverend Mr. Smith calmly, but with aggressiveness in his eye. Mr. Williams sniffed contemptuously, drew off the ring, and deposited it in the pot with such an air as to impress Mr. Whiffles with the idea that the jewel must have been worth at least $4 million. Then Mr. Williams leaned back in his chair and smiled. "What you goin' ter do?" asked the Reverend Mr. Smith, deliberately ignoring Mr. Williams's action. Mr. Williams pointed to the ring and smiled. "Lift yo' $10. "On what?" "Dat ring." "Dat ring?" "Yessuh." Mr. Williams was still cool. "Huh!" The Reverend Mr. Smith picked the ring up, examined it scientifically with one eye closed, dropped it several times as if to test its soundness, and then walked across and rasped it several times heavily on the window pane. "What you doin' dat for?" excitedly asked Mr. Williams. A double rasp with the ring was the Reverend Mr. Smith's only reply. "Gimme dat jewel back," demanded Mr. Williams. The Reverend Mr. Smith was now vigorously rubbing the setting of the stone on the floor. "Leggo dat sparkler," said Mr. Williams again. The Reverend Mr. Smith carefully polished off the scratches by rubbing the ring a while on the sole of his foot. Then he resumed his seat and put the precious thing back into the pot. Then he looked calmly at Mr. Williams and leaned back in his chair as if waiting for something. "Is yo' satisfied?" said Mr. Williams in the tone used by men who have sustained a deep injury. "Dis is poker," said the Reverend Mr. Thankful Smith. "I rised yo' $10, said Mr. Williams, pointing to the ring. "Did yer ever saw 3 balls hanging over my door?" asked the Reverend Mr. Smith. "Doesn't yo' know my name hain't Oppenheimer?" "What do yo' mean?" asked Mr. Williams excitedly. "Poker am poker, and dar's no occasion for trifling with blue glass and junk in dis yar club," said the Reverend Mr. Smith. "I lifts yo' $10, said Mr. Williams, ignoring the insult. "Put up de collateral," said the Reverend Mr. Smith. "4 chips is 40, and $1's $1.40, and dat's $1.44. "Whar's de 4 cents?" smiled Mr. Williams desperately. The Reverend Mr. Smith pointed to the ring. Mr. Williams rose indignantly, shucked off his coat, hat, vest, suspenders, and scarf pin, heaped them on the table, then sat down and glared at the Reverend Mr. Smith. Mr. Smith rolled up the coat, put on the hat, threw his own out the window, gave the ring to Mr. Whiffles, jammed the suspenders into his pocket, and took in the vest, chips, and money. "Dis yar's burglary," yelled Mr. Williams. The Reverend Mr. Smith spread out 4 8s and rose impressively. "Toot," he said. "Don't trifle with Providence. Because a man wars 10-cent grease and gets his Julie on de Bowery, it's no sign that he can buck again cash in a jacker and get a boodle from 4/8. Yo's now in your shirt sleeves and low spirits, but you spence and wallable. I's willing to stand a beer in Sassinger and shake and call it squar. De club now, Jern. Mr. Blaine used to tell this story. Once in Dublin, toward the end of the opera, Satan was conducting Faust through a trap door which represented the gates of Hades. His Majesty got through all right. He was used to going below, but Faust, who was quite stout, got only about halfway in, and no squeezing would get him any farther. Suddenly an Irishman in the gallery exclaimed devoutly, "Thank God, hell is full!" While Mark Twain was ill in London, a report that he had died was circulated. It spread to America and reached Charles Dudley Warner in Hartford, Connecticut. Mr. Warner immediately cabled to London to find out if it was really so. The cablegram in some way came directly into the humorist's hands, and he forthwith cabled the following reply: "Reports of my death greatly exaggerated." End of section 24.
Section 25 of Little Masterpieces of American Wit and Humor, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Claudia Barrett. Little Masterpieces of American Wit and Humor, Volume 2. Edited by Thomas Lansing Mason. Section 25. The Fox and the Crow by George T. Lanigan. A crow, having secured a piece of cheese, flew with its prize to a lofty tree, and was preparing to devour the luscious morsel, when a crafty fox, halting at the foot of the tree, began to cast about how he might obtain it. "How tasteful is your dress!" he cried, in well-feigned ecstasy. "It cannot surely be that your musical education has been neglected? Will you not oblige?"
"I have a horrid cold,"
replied the crow.
"I never sing without my music. But since you press me, at the same time I should add that I have read Aesop and been there before."
So saying, she deposited the cheese in a safe place on the limb of the tree and favored him with a song. "Thank you," exclaimed the fox, and trotted away with the remark that Welsh rabbits never agreed with him, and were far inferior in quality to the animate variety. Moral. The foregoing fable is supported by a whole Gatling battery of morals. We are taught, 1. That it pays to take the papers. 2. That invitation is not always the sincerest flattery. 3. That a stalled rabbit with contentment is better than no bread. And 4. That the aim of art is to conceal disappointment. End of section 25. Recording by Claudia Barrett.
Section 26 of Little Masterpieces of American Wit and Humor, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Melvin Lee. Little Masterpieces of American Wit and Humor, Volume 2, Section 26, Behold the Deeds, by Henry Culler Bunner. I would that all men my hard case might know, how grievously I suffer for no sin. I, Adolph Culpeper Ferguson, for lo, I of my landlady am locked in, for being short on this sad Saturday, nor having shekels of silver wherewith to pay. She is turned and is departed with my key. Wherefore, not even as other boarders free, I sing, as prisoners to their dungeon stones, when for 10 days they expiate a spree. Behold the deeds that are done of Mrs. Jones. 1 night and 1 day have I wept my woe, nor wot I when the morrow doth begin, if I shall have to write to Briggs and Company, to pray them to advance the requisite 10 for ransom of their salesman, that he may go forth as other boarders go alway, as those I hear now flocking from their tea, led by the daughter of my landlady, piano ward. This day for all my moans, dry bread and water have been served me. Behold the deeds that are done of Mrs. Jones. Miss Amabel Jones is musical, and so the heart of the young he-boarder doth win, playing the Maiden's Prayer adagio, that fetcheth him, as fetcheth the banco skin, the innocent rustic. For my part I pray, that Badrzewska maid may wait for I, ere sits she with a lover, as did we once sit together, Amabel. Can it be that all that arduous wooing not atones for Saturday's shortness of trade dollars 3? Behold the deeds that are done of Mrs. Jones. Yea, she forgets the arm was wont to go round her waist. She wears a buckle whose pin galleth the crook of the young man's elbow. I forget not, for I that youth have been. Smith was aforetime the Lothario gay, yet once I mind me Smith was forced to stay close in his room. Not calm as I was he, but his noise brought no pleasance verily. Small ease he gat of playing on the bones, or hammering on his stovepipe that I see. Behold the deeds that are done of Mrs. Jones. Thou, for whose fear the figurative crow I eat, accursed be thou and all thy kin. Thee will I show up, yea, up will I show thy too thick buckwheats, and thy tea too thin. Aye, here I dare thee, ready for the fray. Thou dost not keep a first-class house, I say. It does not with advertisements agree. Thou lodgest a Briton with a puggaree, and thou hast harbored Jacobses and Cohens and a Mulligan. Thus denounce I thee. Behold the deeds that are done of Mrs. Jones. Envoy. Boarders, the worst I have not told ye. She hath stolen my trousers, that I may not flee privily by the window. Hence these groans. There is no fleeing in a robe de nuit. Behold the deeds that are done of Mrs. Jones. Secretary Chase was not originally a profane man. He learned how to swear after he went into Lincoln's cabinet. One day after he had delivered himself vigorously, Lincoln said to him, "Mr. Chase, are you an Episcopalian?" "Why do you ask?" was a somewhat surprised counter-question. "Oh, just out of curiosity," replied Lincoln. "Seward is an Episcopalian, and I had noticed that you and he swore in much the same manner." Family physician. "Well, I congratulate you." Patient excitedly. "I will recover?" Family physician. "Not exactly. But, well, after consultation we find that your disease is entirely novel, and if the autopsy should demonstrate that fact, we have decided to name it after you. End section 26.
Section 27 of Little Masterpieces of American Wit and Humor, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Little Masterpieces of American Wit and Humor, Volume 2. Edited by Thomas Lansing Masson. Section 27. An Insurance Agent's Story. "Oh, I guess we have our experiences," laughed the fire insurance agent. "We are just like others who have to deal with all kinds of people. Take the smart Alecs, for instance. They give us a whirl once in a while, but we generally manage to get as good as we draw with them. It was only last fall that one of them came in and wanted me to insure his coal pile. Of course I caught on at once, but I made out his policy and took his money. In the spring he came around with a broad grin on his face and told me that the coal had been burned. In the furnace, of course. I solemnly informed him that we must decline to settle the loss. He said he would sue. I told him to blaze away, and I would have him arrested as an incendiary. That straightened his face out, and it cost him a tidy little supper for a dozen of us just to ensure our silence. One shrewd old chap had grown rich out of our company, and when he had built an elegant new store and stocked it with goods, he came to us again for insurance. I refused him, but he was persistent, and I finally assented on condition that he hang a gross of hand grenades in the place. After I'd seen them properly distributed, I sent an old chum of his up to get the real lay of the land, for I was still suspicious. This is what the cronies said to each other. "What is them things, Ike?" "Hand grenades." "What's hand grenades?" "I don't know what was in 'em at first, but they're full of kerosene oil now." We canceled the policy. A girl from town is staying with some country cousins who live at a farm. On the night of her arrival she finds to her mortification that she is ignorant of all sorts of things connected with farm life which to her country cousins are matters of everyday knowledge. She fancies they seem amused at her ignorance. At breakfast the following morning she sees on the table a dish of fine honey, whereupon she thinks she has found an opportunity of retrieving her humiliating experience of the night before, and of showing her country cousins that she knows something of country life after all. So, looking at the dish of honey, she says carelessly, "Ah, I see you keep a bee." Minister at baptismal font. "Name, please." Mother, baby born abroad. "Philip Ferdinand Chesterfield Randolph E. Livingston." Minister aside to assistant. "Mr. Kneeler, a little more water, please." End of section 27. Section 28 of Little Masterpieces of American Wit and Humor, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Little Masterpieces of American Wit and Humor, Volume 2. Edited by Thomas Lansing Masson. Section 28. Frank Dempster Sherman. A Rhyme for Priscilla. Dear Priscilla, quaint and very, like a modern Puritan, is a modest, literary, merry young American. Horace she has read, and Bion is her favorite in Greek. Shakespeare is a mighty lion, in whose den she dares but peek. Him she leaves to some sage Daniel, since of lions she's afraid. She prefers a playful spaniel, such as Herrick or as Praed. And it's not a bit satiric, to confess her fancy goes from the epic to a lyric on a rose. Wise Priscilla, dilettante, with a sentimental mind, doesn't deign to dip in Dante, and to Milton isn't kind. L'allegro, il penseroso, have some merits she will grant. All the rest is only so-so, and her paradise she can't. She might make a charming angel, and she will if she is good, but it's doubtful if the change'll make the epic understood. Honeysuckling like a bee, she goes and pillages his sweets, and it's plain enough to see she worships Keats. Gay Priscilla, just the person for the locker whom she loves. What a captivating verse on her neat-fitting gowns or gloves he could write in catching measure, setting all the heart astir! And to Aldrich what a pleasure it would be to sing of her, he whose perfect songs have won her lips to quote them day by day. She repeats the rhymes of Bunner in a fascinating way, and you'll often find her lost in she has reveries at times some delightful one of Austin Dobson's rhymes. O Priscilla, sweet Priscilla, writing of you makes me think, as I burn my brown manila and immortalize my ink, how well satisfied these poets ought to be with what they do, when especially they know it's read by such a girl as you. I who sing of you would marry just the kind of girl you are, one who doesn't care to carry her poetic taste too far, one whose fancy is a bright one, who is fond of poems fine, and appreciates a light one, such as mine. As the car reached Westville, an old man with a long white beard rose feebly from a corner seat and tottered toward the door. He was, however, stopped by the conductor, who said, "Your fare, please." "I paid my fare." "When? I don't remember it." "Why, I paid you when I got on the car." "Where did you get on?" "At Fairhaven." "That won't do. When I left Fairhaven there was only a little boy on the car." "Yes," answered the old man, "I know it. I was that little boy." End of Section 28. Section 29 of Little Masterpieces of American Wit and Humor, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Little Masterpieces of American Wit and Humor, Volume 2. Edited by Thomas Lansing Masson. Section 29. An Epitaph. Here lies the body of Susan Lowder, who burst while drinking Seidlitz powder, called from this world to her heavenly rest. She should have waited till it effervesced. End of Section 29. Section 30 of Little Masterpieces of American Wit and Humor, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Little Masterpieces of American Wit and Humor, Volume 2. Edited by Thomas Lansing Masson. Section 30. Thomas Bailey Aldrich. A Rivermouth Romance. At 5 o'clock of the morning of the 10th of July, 1860, the front door of a certain house on Anchor Street, in the ancient seaport town of Rivermouth, might have been observed to open with great caution. This door, as the least imaginative reader may easily conjecture, did not open itself. It was opened by Miss Margaret Callahan, who immediately closed it softly behind her, paused for a few seconds with an embarrassed air on the stone step, and then, throwing a furtive glance up at the second-story windows, passed hastily down the street toward the river, keeping close to the fences and garden walls on her left. There was a ghost-like stealthiness to Miss Margaret's movements, though there was nothing whatever of the ghost about Miss Margaret herself. She was a plump, short person, no longer young, with coal-black hair growing low on the forehead, and a round face that would have been nearly meaningless if the features had not been emphasized, italicized, so to speak, by the smallpox. Moreover, the brilliancy of her toilet would have rendered any ghostly hypothesis untenable. Mrs. Solomon, we refer to the dressiest Mrs. Solomon, whichever one that was, in all her glory was not arrayed like Miss Margaret on that eventful summer morning. She wore a light green, shot silk frock, a blazing red shawl, and a yellow crape bonnet profusely decorated with azure, orange, and magenta artificial flowers. In her hand she carried a white parasol. The newly risen sun, ricocheting from the bosom of the river and striking point blank on the top knot of Miss Margaret's gorgeousness, made her an imposing spectacle in the quiet street of that Puritan village. But, in spite of the bravery of her apparel, she stole guiltily along by garden walls and fences until she reached a small, dingy frame house near the wharves, in the darkened doorway of which she quenched her burning splendor, if so bold a figure is permissible. 3/4 of an hour passed. The sunshine moved slowly up Anchor Street, fingered noiselessly the well-kept brass knockers on either side, and drained the heel-taps of dew which had been left from the revels of the fairies overnight in the cups of the morning glories. Not a soul was stirring yet in this part of the town, though the Rivermouthians are such early birds that not a worm may be said to escape them. By and by, one of the browned Holland shades at one of the upper windows of the Bilkins mansion, the house from which Miss Margaret had emerged, was drawn up, and old Mr. Bilkins in spiral nightcap looked out on the sunny street. Not a living creature was to be seen save the dissipated family cat, a very Lovelace of a cat that was not allowed a night key, who was sitting on the curbstone opposite, waiting for the hall door to open. 3/4 of an hour, we repeat, had passed, when Mrs. Margaret O'Rourke, née Callahan, issued from the small dingy house by the river and regained the doorstep of the Bilkins mansion in the same stealthy fashion in which she had left it. Not to prolong a mystery that must already oppress the reader, Mr. Bilkins' cook had, after the manner of her kind, stolen out of the premises before the family were up, and got herself married, surreptitiously and artfully married, as if matrimony were an indictable offence. And something of an offence it was in this instance. In the first place, Margaret Callahan had lived nearly 20 years with the Bilkins family, and the old people, there were no children now, had rewarded this long service by taking Margaret into their affections. It was a piece of subtle ingratitude for her to marry without admitting the worthy couple to her confidence. In the next place, Margaret had married a man some 18 years younger than herself. That was the young man's lookout, you say. We hold it was Margaret that was to blame. What does a young blade of 22 know? Not half so much as he thinks he does. His exhaustless ignorance at that age is a discovery which is left for him to make in his prime. Curly gold locks cover foolish brains. Billing and cooing is all your cheer. Sighing and singing of midnight strains under Bonnie Bell's window panes. Wait until you come to 40 year. In one sense, Margaret's husband had come to 40 year. She was 40 to a day. Mrs. Margaret O'Rourke, with the baddish cat following closely at her heels, entered the Bilkins mansion, reached her chamber in the attic without being intercepted, and there laid aside her finery. 2 or 3 times, while arranging her more humble attire, she paused to take a look at the marriage certificate, which she had deposited between the leaves of her prayer book, and on each occasion held that potent document upside down. For Margaret's literary culture was of the severest order and excluded the art of reading. The breakfast was late that morning. As Mrs. O'Rourke set the coffee urn in front of Mrs. Bilkins and flanked Mr. Bilkins with the broiled mackerel and buttered toast, Mrs. O'Rourke's conscience smote her. She afterward declared that when she saw the two sitting there so innocent-like, not dreaming of the comether she had put upon them, she secretly and unbeknownst let a few tears fall into the cream pitcher. Whether or not it was this material expression of Margaret's penitence that spoiled the coffee does not admit of inquiry, but the coffee was bad. In fact, The whole breakfast was a comedy of errors. It was a blessed relief to Margaret when the meal was ended. She retired in a cold perspiration to the penetralia of the kitchen, and it was remarked by both Mr. and Mrs. Bilkins that those short flights of vocalism, apropos of the personal charms of one Kate Kearney, who lived on the banks of Killarney, which ordinarily issued from the direction of the scullery, were unheard that forenoon. The town clock was striking 11, and the antiquated timepiece on the staircase, which never spoke but it dropped pearls and crystals like the fairy in the story, was lisping the hour, when there came 3 tremendous knocks at the street door. Mrs. Bilkins, who was dusting the brass-mounted chronometer in the hall, stood transfixed, with arm uplifted. The admirable old lady had for years been carrying on a guerrilla warfare with itinerant vendors of furniture polish and painkiller and crockery cement and the like. The effrontery of the triple knock convinced her the enemy was at her gates. Possibly that dissolute creature with 24 sheets of notepaper and 24 envelopes for 15 cents. Mrs. Bilkins swept across the hall and opened the door with a jerk. The suddenness of the movement was apparently not anticipated by the person outside, who, with one arm stretched feebly toward the receding knocker, tilted gently forward and rested both hands on the threshold in an attitude which was probably common enough with our ancestors of the Simian period, but could never have been considered graceful. By an effort that testified to the excellent condition of his muscles, the person instantly righted himself and stood swaying unsteadily on his toes and heels and smiling rather vaguely on Mrs. Bilkins. It was a slightly built but well-knitted young fellow, in the not unpicturesque garb of our marine service. His woolen cap, pitched forward at an acute angle with his nose, showed the back part of a head thatched with short yellow hair, which had broken into innumerable curls of painful tightness. On his ruddy cheeks a sparse sandy beard was making a timid debut. Add to this a weak, good-natured mouth, a pair of devil-may-care blue eyes, and the fact that the man was very drunk, and you have a pre-Raphaelite portrait, we may as well say at once, of Mr. Larry O'Rourke of Mullingar, County Westmeath, and late of the United States sloop of war Santee. The man was a total stranger to Mrs. Bilkins. But the instant she caught sight of the double white anchors embroidered on the lapels of his jacket, she unhesitatingly threw back the door, which with great presence of mind she had partly closed. A drunken sailor standing on the step of the Bilkins mansion was no novelty. The street, as we have stated, led down to the wharves, and sailors were constantly passing. The house abutted directly on the street, the granite doorstep was almost flush with the sidewalk, and the huge old-fashioned brass knocker, seemingly a brazen hand that had been cut off at the wrist and nailed against the oak as a warning to malefactors, extended itself in a kind of grim appeal to everybody. It seemed to possess strange fascinations for all seafaring folk, and when there was a man-of-war in port, the rat-tat-tat of that knocker would frequently startle the quiet neighborhood long after midnight. There appeared to be an occult understanding between it and the bluejackets. Years ago there was a young Bilkins, one Pendexter Bilkins, a sad losel, we fear, who ran away to try his fortunes before the mast, and fell overboard in a gale off Hatteras. Lost at sea, says the chubby marble slab in the Old South burying ground. Etat 18. Perhaps that is why no bluejacket, sober or drunk, was ever repulsed from the door of the Bilkins mansion. Of course Mrs. Bilkins had her taste in the matter, and preferred them sober, but as this could not always be, she tempered her wind, so to speak, to the shorn lamb. The flushed, prematurely old face that now looked up at her moved the good lady's pity. "What do you want?" she asked kindly. Me wife." "There's no wife for you here," said Mrs. Bilkins, somewhat taken aback. His wife, she thought. It's a mother the poor boy needs. "Me wife," repeated Mr. O'Rourke, "for better or for worse." "You had better go away," said Mrs. Bilkins, bridling up, "or it will be the worse for you." "To have and to hold," continued Mr. O'Rourke, wandering retrospectively in the mazes of the marriage service. "To have and to hold till death. Bad luck to him. Takes one or the other of us." "You're a blasphemous creature," said Mrs. Bilkins severely. "Them's the words his riverence spake this morning, standing forninst us," explained Mr. O'Rourke. "I stood here, see, and me jewel stood there, and the howly chaplain beyont." And Mr. O'Rourke, with a wavering forefinger, drew a diagram of the interesting situation on the doorstep. "Well," returned Mrs. Bilkins, "if you're a married man, all I have to say is, there's a pair of fools instead of one. You had better be off. The person you want doesn't live here." "Bedad thin, but she does." "Lives here?" "Sorra a place else." "The man's crazy," said Mrs. Bilkins to herself. While she thought him simply drunk, she was not in the least afraid. But the idea that she was conversing with a madman sent a chill over her. She reached back her hand preparatory to shutting the door, when Mr. O'Rourke, with an agility that might have been expected from his previous gymnastics, set one foot on the threshold and frustrated the design. "I want me wife," he said sternly. Unfortunately, Mr. Bilkins had gone uptown, and there was no one in the house except Margaret, whose pluck was not to be depended on. The case was urgent. With the energy of despair, Mrs. Bilkins suddenly placed the toe of her boot against Mr. O'Rourke's invading foot and pushed it away. The effect of this attack was to cause Mr. O'Rourke to describe a complete circle on one leg and then sit down heavily on the threshold. The lady retreated to the hat stand and rested her hand mechanically on the handle of a blue cotton umbrella. Mr. O'Rourke partly turned his head and smiled upon her with conscious superiority. At this juncture a third actor appeared on the scene, evidently a friend of Mr. O'Rourke, for he addressed that gentleman as a spalpeen, and told him to go home. "Divil an inch," replied the spalpeen, but he got himself off the threshold and resumed his position on the step. "It's only Larry, mum," said the man, touching his forelock politely. "As dacent a lad as ever lived, when he's not in liquor. And I've known him to be sober for days together," he added reflectively. "He don't mane hapworth o' harm, but just now he's not quite in his right mind." "I should think not," said Mrs. Bilkins, turning from the speaker to Mr. O'Rourke, who had seated himself gravely on the scraper and was weeping. "Hasn't the man any friends?" "Too many of 'em, mum, and it's along with drinking toast with them that Larry got throwed. The punch that spalpeen has drunk this day would amaze ye. He give us the slip whiles ago, bad cess to him, and come up here. Didn't I tell ye, Larry, not to be afther ringing? And the ould gentleman's knocker. Ain't ye got no sense at all?" "Mr. Donoghue," responded Mr. O'Rourke with great dignity, "you're drunk again." Mr. O'Donoghue, who had not taken more than 13 ladles of rum punch, disdained to reply directly. "He's a dacent lad enough," this to Mrs. Bilkins, "but his head is wake. When he's had 2 sups of whiskey, he believes he's drunk a barrelful. A gill o' weather out of a Jimmy John'll fuddle him, mum." "Isn't there anybody to look after him?" "No, mum, he's an orphan. His father and mother live in the ould country, and a fine, hale, ould couple they are." "Hasn't he any family in the town?" "Sure, mum, he has a family. Wasn't he married this blessed morning?" "He said so." "Indade, thin, he was. Poor devil. And the person? inquired Mrs. Bilkins. Is it the wife, ye mane? Yes, the wife. Where is she? Well then, mum, said Mr. Donahue, it's yourself can answer that. I? exclaimed Mrs. Bilkins. Good heavens, this man's as crazy as the other. Begorra, if anybody's crazy, it's Larry, for it's Larry has married Margaret. What Margaret? cried Mrs. Bilkins. Margaret Callahan, sure. Our Margaret? Do you mean to say that our Margaret has married that good-for-nothing inebriated wretch? It's a civil tongue the old lady has, anyway, remarked Mr. O'Rourke critically from the scraper. Mrs. Bilkins' voice during the latter part of the colloquy had been pitched in a high key. It rung through the hall and penetrated to the kitchen, where Margaret was wiping the breakfast things. She paused, with a half-dried saucer in her hand, and listened. In a moment more she stood, with bloodless face and limp figure, leaning against the banister behind Mrs. Bilkins. "Is it there ye are, me jewel?" cried Mr. O'Rourke, discovering her. Mrs. Bilkins wheeled upon Margaret. "Margaret Callahan! Is that thing your husband?" Yes, mum," faltered Mrs. O'Rourke, with woeful lack of spirit. "Then take it away!" cried Mrs. Bilkins. Margaret, with a slight flush on either cheek, glided past Mrs. Bilkins, and the heavy oak door closed with a bang, as the gates of paradise must have closed of old upon Adam and Eve. "Come," said Margaret, taking Mr. O'Rourke by the hand, and the two wandered forth upon their wedding journey down Anchor Street, with all the world before them where to choose. They chose to halt at the small, shabby tenement house by the river, through the doorway of which the bridal pair disappeared with a reeling, eccentric gait. For Mr. O'Rourke's intoxication seemed to have run down his elbow and communicated itself to Margaret. "O Hymen, who burnest precious gums and scented woods in thy torch at the melting of aristocratic hearts, with what a pitiful penny dip thou hast lighted up our little back street romance." Major Daw and Other Stories. The story is told of a famous Boston lawyer, that one day, after having a slight discussion with the judge, he deliberately turned his back upon that personage and started to walk off. "Are you trying, sir, to show your contempt for the court?" asked the judge sternly. "No, sir," was the reply. "I'm trying to conceal it." End of section 30.
Section 31 of Little Masterpieces of American Wit and Humor, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Claudia Barrett. Little Masterpieces of American Wit and Humor, Volume 2, edited by Thomas Lansing Mason. Section 31, The Bohemians of Boston, by Gillette Burgess. The Orchids were as tough a crowd as Boston anywhere allowed. It was a club of wicked men, the oldest 12, the youngest 10. They drank their soda color green. They talk of art and Philistine. They wore buff waistcoats, and their hair, it used to make the waiters stare. They were so shockingly behaved, and Boston thought them so depraved, policemen stationed at the door would raid them every hour or more. They used to smoke and laugh out loud. They were a very devilish crowd. They formed a cult far subtler, brainier than ordinary Anglomania. For all as Jacobites were reckoned, and gaily toasted Charles II. What would the bonny Charlie say if he could see that crowd today? Fitzwillieboe McFlubadub was regent of the Orchids Club. A wild bohemian was he, and spent his money fast and free. He thought no more of spending dimes on some debauch of pickled limes than you would think of spending nickels to buy a pint of German pickles. The Boston maiden passed him by with sidelong glances of her eye. She dared not speak, he was so wild, yet worshipped this Lotharian child. Fitz Willieboy was so blasé, he burned a transcript up one day. The orchids fashion all their style on Flubadub's infernal guile. The awful Boston oath was his, he used to ejaculate, "Gee whiz!" He showed them that immortal haunt, the dirty Chinese restaurant. And there they find him even when it got to be as late as 10. He ate chop suey with a fork. You should have heard the villain talk. Of one reported that he knew, an artist and an actor too. The orchids went from bad to worse, made epigrams, attempted verse. Boston was horrified and shocked to hear the way those orchids mocked, for they made fun of Boston ways and called good men provincial jays. The end must come to such a story. Gone is the wicked orchid's glory. The room was raided by police one night for breaches of the peace. There had been laughter long and loud. In Boston this is not allowed. And there the sergeant of the squad found awful evidence, my God. Fitz Willieboy McFlubadub, the regent of the Orchids Club, had written on the window sill this shocking outrage, Beacon H.LL, in the Burgess Nonsense Book. End of section 31. Recording by Claudia Barrett.
Section 32 of Little Masterpieces of American Wit and Humor, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Little Masterpieces of American Wit and Humor, Volume 2. Edited by Thomas Lansing Masson. Section 32. Marion Couthoy Smith, The Composite Ghost. They were placed on exhibition in a long imposing row, all who'd borne the name of Spriggins for 3 centuries or so. From old Amram, who came over in the Pilgrim Father's track, to the late lamented Jane, for whom the family still wore black. They stood upon a hardwood shelf, in rich and proud array, not disposed, I beg to state, in any grim, offensive way. They were not a row of mummies, standing terrible and tall, nor a grisly stack of coffins, piled up high along the wall. You never came across a skull, nor stumbled on a bone, nor a human frame in lattice work left rattling there alone. Your nerves would never suffer there from sudden shocks or turns. There was nothing but a score or two of classic little urns, which held their sacred contents sealed in elegant reserve, like a ghastly kind of jam or supernatural preserve. You never would suspect that in those graceful rows the entire Spriggins ancestry could peacefully repose. 'Tis a plan that's most convenient, thus within a little space, to have your relatives condensed, and keep them in a vase. For if you care to travel, why, wherever you may go, you can simply take your family vault along with you, you know. You can have the whole collection sent by Peterson's Express, to be a genteel solace in bereavement and distress. Besides, it is the prettiest end a man could wish himself, to be gathered to his fathers in an urn upon a shelf. There rested all the Spriggins tribe, each in his little urn, on which the names and dates were carved as each had died in turn. And Spriggins père was proud of them, and often went to weep beside the sacred shelf on which he one day hoped to sleep. One fatal afternoon it chanced that Spriggins' youngest son, whose unchristian age was 7, and whose Christian name was John, obtained the key to that small room, and found that sacred store of the ashes of his fathers, which he ne'er had seen before. This Johnny was a clever boy, much given to research, his very nose turned up, with interrogatory perch. His head, excuse the slang, was very level, you'll surmise, but 'twas level where his bump of veneration ought to rise. He knew they were his relatives, within those vases packed, but he didn't care a button for that interesting fact. All he wanted was to reach those curious urns and take them down. Alas! the shelf was several feet above his little crown. There came a sudden avalanche, and flat upon the floor he lay, sprinkled with the ashes of a century or more. A portion of his grandpa ran in torrents down his neck, and round him all his great-great-aunts were lying by the peck. He had pilgrim fathers in his shoes, all trickling round his toes. He had grandmas in his hair, and he had cousins in his nose. And worst of all, a fragment of the late lamented Jane had lodged beneath his eyelid, and was causing dreadful pain. But John had lots of courage, and he didn't stop to cry, not even with the ashes of his sister in his eye. He only gasped, and quickly rose, and ruefully surveyed the ruin and confusion that his luckless fall had made. He could sweep up all the ashes, but things never could be fixed, for the worthy house of Spriggins was inextricably mixed. Such stirring up would stagger e'en the very stoutest brain. Why, you couldn't tell old Amram from the late lamented Jane. The scions of this honour'd line, all by that little loon, might just as well have been stirred up, like pudding, with a spoon. 'Twas very sad, but Johnny, yielding not to thoughts of gloom, brought up a chair to stand on, and a dustpan and a broom. And soon that little room was very, very cleanly swept, and urns and ashes all put back just where they had been kept. You never, never would suspect what that one day had cost, and that in that act each Spriggins's identity was lost. That night, alas! Pa Spriggins, in a solemn frame of mind, betook himself to that small room, as oft he felt inclined, and he shut the door, and sat him down those urns to contemplate, while appropriate reflections chased each other through his pate. For he loved to pensively recount the treasures of the past, and wondered constantly how long the family would last. The place was dark and gloomy, he was shut up there alone, when suddenly his hair stood up, he heard a hollow groan. The cover of the largest urn rose up a little way, a mist came forth, which altered to a figure dim and grey. It rose up from the ashes, like the phoenix known of old, but of such an awful bird as this the ancients never told. It bore a distant likeness to the figure of a man, but picture such a nondescript I know I never can. It had a grey old head upon the shoulders of a child. One eye was small and wicked, and the other large and wild. Its hands, its feet, its teeth, its ears, I solemnly declare, you couldn't pick out two of them that matched to make a pair. One foot was slim and dainty, and the other huge and flat, and it had a woman's wig on underneath a man's cocked hat, a waistcoat like George Washington's, a blazer and a train, that Spriggins knew had once belonged to his departed Jane. He sank upon his bonded knees, with terror quite unmanned. It stood upon its one large foot, and waved its biggest hand, and spake, "Unhappy man," it said, "for this have we been burned? For this have we been kept here long, so carefully inurned? Oh, see upon this sacred shelf what dire confusion reigns! Wretch, what have you been doing with your ancestors' remains? You listened to your father's voice, but thanks, I fear, to you, it is your uncle Solomon whose mouth it's speaking through. Oh, tell me who or what I am, and how long I've been dead, and tell me if I've got my own or some one else's head. I don't belong to any special period at all. Am I my Aunt Keziah, or am I your brother Paul? O Spriggins, Ebenezer J, O wretch, O fool, O rash! How could you mix our ashes in one vast ancestral hash? Thus ending with a mingled wail of misery and rage, that awful vision ceased to speak, and vanished from the stage, while ghostly groanings issued from the various urns around. But poor old Spriggins heard no more, he swooned upon the ground. And now these mingled embers 'neath memorial marbles lie, and Spriggins and his family will be buried when they die. End of section 32.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Little Masterpieces of American Wit and Humor, Volume 2, edited by Thomas Lansing Masson. Section 33, some messages received by teachers in Brooklyn Public Schools. The fact that the Slab City parents object to clay modeling in the schools is illustrated in the following note sent to a teacher in one of the 10th Ward schools. Miss, John came home yesterday wid his clothes covered wid mud. He said you put him to work mixing clay when he ought to be learning to read and write. Me man carries the hod, and God knows I have enough trouble wid his clothes in the wash without scraping John's coat. If he comes home like this again, I'll send him back to yez to wash his clothes. Mrs. O.R. Here's one from a Brownsville mother who objects to physical culture. Miss Brown, you must stop teach my Lizzie physical torture. She needs yet readin' and figures mit sums more as that. If I want her to do jumpin', I can make her jump. Mrs. Kanavowski. The number of parents who object to the temperance plank in the educational platform is greater than the number of objectors to any other class of study in Williamsburg. Here's a copy of a note sent to a teacher in the Stagg Street School. Miss, my boy tells me that when I drink the beer, the overcoat from my stomach gets too thick. Please be so kind and don't interfere in my family affairs. Mr. Chris. Here's a sample on the same subject sent to a teacher in the Mauger Street School. Dear teacher, you should mind your own business and not tell Jake he should not drink beer. So long he live, he drinks the beer, and he drinks it yen when Bill Raines is dead. If you interfere some more, I go on the board of education. W.S. In this school, the teachers are often compelled to listen to long arguments on the excise question, and the parents who call around to argue become greatly excited when told that the children are taught not to taste alcoholic liquors. One little boy told his teacher that his mother had given him orders to get up and leave the classroom during the hour for discussing the alcohol question. The teacher told the boy to ask his mother to call around at the schoolhouse. She wrote this note instead. Teacher, John says you want to see me. I have a beer saloon and 9 children. Business is good in morning and afternoon. How can I come? The Pickleville parents, as a rule, never omit the obliging end of a note, as will be seen in the following, sent to a teacher of the Wall Street School. Dear teacher, please excuse Fritz for staying home. He had der measles to oblige his father. J.B. And here is another of the obliging kind. Teacher, please excuse Henny for not coming in school, as he died from the car run over on Tuesday. By doing so, you will greatly oblige his loving mother. Here is one sent to the Brownsville School. Dear Miss Baker, please excuse Rachel for being away those 2 days. Her grandmother died to oblige her mother. Mrs. Rensky. The child mentioned in the following note was neither German nor Irish, but he is back in school after a battle with the doctors. Miss, Frank could not come these 3 weeks because he had the ammonia and information of the vowels. Mrs. Smith. The notes sent are sometimes written on scented paper, and as a rule, these are misspelled. Here is a scented paper sample. Teacher, you must excuse my girl for not coming to school. She was sick and laid in a common dose state for 3 days. Mrs. W. In this same school, a teacher received the following. Miss, please let Willie home at 2 o'clock. I take him out for a little pleasure to see his grandfather's grave. Mrs. R. Still another mother wrote the following. Miss, please be so kind, and knock hell out of Saul when he gives too much lip to oblige his mother. End of section 33. Recording by Jane Muir.
Section 34 of Little Masterpieces of American Wit and Humor, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Little Masterpieces of American Wit and Humor, Volume 2. Edited by Thomas Lansing Masson. Section 34. The Trout's Appeal. Don't visit the commonplace Winnipesaukee, or the rivulet Onoquinnipaskisanognog, nor climb to the summit of Bear Moosilauke, and look eastward toward the clear Umbagog, but come into Maine to the Welloquennepaucock, or to the saucy little river Essequassagook, or still smaller stream of Chinquassapuntacook. Then visit me last on the great Anassaguntacook. End of section 34.
Section 35 of Little Masterpieces of American Wit and Humor, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Claudia Barrett. Little Masterpieces of American Wit and Humor, Volume 2. Edited by Thomas Lansing Mason. Section 35. A Fatal Thirst by Bill Nye. From the London Lancet, we learn that many years ago a case was recorded by Dr. Otto of Copenhagen in which 495 needles passed through the skin of a hysterical girl who had probably swallowed them during a hysterical paroxysm. But these all emerged from the regions below the diaphragm and were collected in groups, which gave rise to inflammatory swellings of some size. One of these contained 100 needles. Quite recently, Dr. Bigger described before the Society of Surgery of Dublin a case in which more than 300 needles were removed from the body of a woman. It is very remarkable in how few cases the needles were the cause of death, and how slight an interference with function their presence and movement caused. It would seem, from the cases on record, that needles in the system rather assist in the digestion and promote longevity. For instance, we will suppose that the hysterical girl above alluded to, with 495 needles in her stomach, should absorb the midsummer cucumber. Think how interesting those needles would make it for the great colic promoter. We can imagine the cheerful smile of the cucumber as it enters the stomach, and, bowing cheerfully to the follicles standing around, hangs its hat upon the walls of the stomach, stands its umbrella in a corner, and proceeds to get in its work. All at once the cucumber looks surprised and grieved about something. It stops in its heaven-born colic generation and pulls a rusty needle out of its person. Maddened by the pain, it once more attacks the digestive apparatus, and once more accumulates a choice job lot of needles. Again and again it enters into the unequal contest, each time losing ground and gaining ground, till the poor cucumber, with assorted hardware sticking out in all directions like the hair on a cat's tail, at last curls up like a caterpillar and yields up the victory. Still, this needle business will be expensive to husbands. if wives once acquire the habit and allow it to obtain the mastery over them. If a wife once permits this demon appetite for cambric needles to get control of the house, it will soon secure a majority in the Senate, and then there will be trouble. The woman who once began to tamper with cambric needles is not safe. She may think that she has power to control her appetite, but it is only a step to the maddening thirst for the darning needle, and perhaps to the button hook and carpet stretcher. It is safer and better to crush the first desire for needles than to undertake, when it is too late, reformation from the abject slavery to this hellish thirst. We once knew a sweet young creature, with dewy eye and breath like Timothy hay. Her merry laugh rippled out upon the summer air like the joyful music of bald-headed bobolinks. Everybody loved her, and she loved everybody too, but in a thoughtless moment she swallowed a cambric needle. This did not satisfy her. The cruel thraldom had begun. Whenever she felt depressed and gloomy, there was nothing that would kill her ennui and melancholy but the fatal needle cushion. From this she rapidly became more reckless, till there was hardly an hour that she was not under the influence of needles. If she couldn't get needles to assuage her mad thirst, she would take hairpins or door keys. She gradually pined away to a mere skeleton. She could no longer sit on one foot and be happy. Life for her was filled with opaque gloom and sadness. At last she took an overdose of sheep shears and monkey wrenches one day, and on the following morning her soul had lit out for the land of eternal summer. We should learn from this to shun the maddening needle cushion as we would a viper, and never tell a lie. End of section 35.
Section 36 of Little Masterpieces of American Wit and Humor, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Little Masterpieces of American Wit and Humor, Volume 2. Edited by Thomas Lansing Masson. Section 36. George W. Peck. Peck's Bad Boy. "Say, are you a mason or a Nodfellow or anything?" asked the bad boy of the grocery man as he went to the cinnamon bag on the shelf and took out a long stick of cinnamon bark to chew. "Why, yes, of course I am. But what set you to thinking of that?" asked the grocery man as he went to the desk and charged the boy's father with a half-pound of cinnamon. "Well, do the goats bunt when you 'nitiate a fresh candidate?" "No, of course not. The goats are cheap ones that have no life, and we muzzle them and put pillows over their heads so they can't hurt anybody," said the grocery man as he winked at a brother Oddfellow who was seated on a sugar barrel, looking mysterious. "But why do you ask?" "Oh, nothin'. Only I wish me and my chum had muzzled our goat with a pillow. Pa would have enjoyed his becoming a member of our lodge better. You see, Pa had been telling us how much good the Masons and Oddfellers did, and said we ought to try and grow up good so we could jine the lodges when we got big. And I asked Pa if it would do any hurt for us to have a play lodge in my room and pretend to 'nitiate, and Pa said it wouldn't do any hurt. He said it would improve our minds and learn us to be men. So my chum and me borrowed a goat that lives in a livery stable. Say, did you know they keep a goat in a livery stable so the horses won't get sick? They get used to the smell of the goat, and after that nothing can make them sick but a glue factory. You see, my chum and me had to carry the goat up to my room when Ma and Pa was out riding, and he blatted so we had to tie a handkerchief around his nose, and his feet made such a noise on the floor that we put some baby socks on his hoofs. Well, my chum and me practiced with the goat until he could bunt the picture of a goat every time. We borrowed a Bock beer sign from a saloon man and hung it on the back of a chair, and the goat would hit it every time. That night Pa wanted to know what we were doing up in my room, and I told him we were playing lodge and improving our minds. Pa said that was right. There was nothing that did boys of our age half so much good as to imitate men, and store by useful knowledge. Then my chum asked Pa if he didn't want to come up and take the grand bumper degree, and Pa laughed and said he didn't care if he did, just to encourage us boys in innocent pastime that was so improving to our intellects. We had shut the goat up in a closet in my room, and he had got over blatting, so we took off the handkerchief, and he was eating some of my paper collars and skate straps. We went upstairs and told Pa to come up pretty soon and give 3 distinct raps, and when we asked him who comes there he must say, "A pilgrim who wants to join your ancient order and ride the goat." Ma wanted to come up too, but we told her if she come in it would break up the lodge, 'cause a woman couldn't keep a secret, and we didn't have any side saddle for the goat. Say, if you never tried it, the next time you initiate a man in your Mason's lodge, you sprinkle a little cayenne pepper on the goat's beard just before you turn him loose. You can get 3 times as much fun to the square inch of goat. You wouldn't think it was the same goat. Well, we got all fixed, and Pa rapped, and we let him in, and told him he must be blindfolded, and he got on his knees a-laughing, and I tied a towel round his eyes, and then I turned him around and made him get down on his hands also, and then his back was right toward the closet sign, and I put the Bock beer sign right against Pa's clothes. He was a-laughing all the time, and said we boys were as full of fun as they made 'em, and we told him it was a solemn occasion, and we wouldn't permit no levity, and if he didn't stop laughing we couldn't give him the grand bumper degree. Then everything was ready, and my chum had his hand on the closet door and some cayenne pepper in his other hand, and I asked Pa in low bass tones if he felt as though he wanted to turn back or if he had nerve enough to go ahead and take the degree. I warned him that it was full of dangers, as the goat was loaded for bear, and told him he yet had time to retrace his steps if he wanted to. He said he wanted the whole business, and we could go ahead with the menagerie. Then I said to Pa that if he had decided to go ahead, and not blame us for the consequences, to repeat after me the following: "Bring forth the royal bumper and let him bump." Pa repeated the words, and my chum sprinkled the cayenne pepper on the goat's mustache, and he sneezed once and looked sassy, and then he see the lager beer goat rearing up, and he started for it just like a crow catcher, and blatted. Pa is real fat, but he knew he got hit, and he grunted and said, "What you boys doin'?" And then the goat gave him another degree, and Pa pulled off the towel and got up and started for the stairs, and so did the goat. And Ma was at the bottom of the stairs listening, and when I looked over the banisters, Pa and Ma and the goat were all in a heap, and Pa was yelling murder, and Ma was screaming fire, and the goat was blatting and sneezing and bunting, and the hired girl came into the hall, and the goat took after her, and she crossed herself just as the goat struck her, and said, "Holy Mother, protect me!" and went downstairs the way we boys slide downhill, with both hands on herself, and the goat reared up and blatted, and Pa and Ma went into their room and shut the door. And then my chum and me opened the front door and drove the goat out. The minister, who comes to see Ma every 3 times a week, was just ringing the bell, and the goat thought he wanted to be initiated too, and gave him one for luck, and then went down the sidewalk blatting and sneezing, and the minister came in the parlor and said he was stabbed, and then Pa came out of his room with his suspenders hanging down, and he didn't know the minister was there, and he said cuss words, and Ma cried and told Pa he would go to the bad place sure, and Pa said he didn't care, he would kill that cussed goat afore he went, and I told Pa the minister was in the parlor, and he and Ma went down and said the weather was propitious for a revival, and it seemed as though an outpouring of the Spirit was about to be vouchsafed, and none of them sot down but Ma, 'cause the goat didn't hit her, and while they were talking religion with their mouths and cussin' the goat inwardly, my chum and me adjourned to the lodge, and I went and stayed with him all night, and I haven't been home since. But I don't believe Pa will lick me, 'cause he said he would not hold us responsible for the consequences. He ordered the goat hisself, and we filled the order, don't you see? Well, I guess I will go and sneak in the back way, and find out from the hired girl how the land lays. She won't go back on me, 'cause the goat was not loaded for hired girls. She just happened to get in at the wrong time. Goodbye, sir. Remember, and give your goat cayenne pepper in your lodge. The average American at home or abroad does not take kindly to anything that would seem to cast the shadow of a shade upon his native land. A story told one evening at the Richmond Avenue Methodist Episcopal Church by the Reverend George W. Peck might be cited in illustration. An Englishman was traveling through Italy with an American friend, and in the course of their sojournings each maintained the superiority of his own country. Finally, the grand spectacle of Mount Vesuvius in eruption, throwing its brilliant rays across the Bay of Naples, burst upon their astonished gaze. "Now look at that!" chuckled the Englishman. "You haven't got anything in America that can come anywhere near that." "No," moodily replied the Yankee. "It is true we have not got a Vesuvius, but we have got a waterfall that could put that thing out in less than 5 minutes." An Illinois paper has the following: "The funeral services of the late William P. Lewis were somewhat hurried to enable his estimable and grief-stricken widow to catch the 2 o'clock train for Chicago, where she goes to visit friends." "Fellow citizens," said the candidate, "I have fought against the Indians. I have often had no bed but the battlefield, and no canopy but the sky. I have marched over the frozen ground till every step has been marked with blood." His story told well, till a dried-up looking voter came to the front. "Did yer say yer'd fought for the Union?" "Yes," replied the candidate. "And agin the Indians?" "Yes, many a time." "And that you had slept on the ground with only the sky for a kiver?" "Certainly." "And that your feet bled in marching over the frozen ground?" "That they did," cried the exultant candidate. "Then I'll be darned if you hain't done enough for your country. Go home and rest. I'll vote for the other fellow." Mrs. L. had often told Mamie, her 4-year-old daughter, that she was never alone because God was always with her. One day Mrs. L. was called from the room and left Mamie for a longer time than she expected. When she came back she said pityingly, "Why, Mamie, have you been here alone all the time? I thought someone would come in." "Oh, I haven't been alone, mamma," Mamie answered, "because God has been with me. But," she added gravely, "He's dreadful poor company." End of Section 36. End of Little Masterpieces of American Wit and Humor, Volume 2, edited by Thomas Lansing Masson.